listen to him. Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up onto the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking with him. They appeared in glory where he was speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the two men stood with him. Just as they were leaving, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he had said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud a voice came that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silent. And in those days, they told no one of any of the things that they had seen. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Two stories. The first one. Before I was married to Caroline, I had the chance to go with several other seminary students to the northeast corner of England to a place called Lindisfarne. It's one of the homes of Celtic Christianity, and it's sort of near the England-Scotland border. There's not really much to Lindisfarne. There's about 150 people that live there year-round, most of whom are a part of a vibrant community that's heavily involved with the Christian church. Now, this particular community at Lindisfarne can trace its roots all the way back to the 7th century, when a saint by the name of Saint Aidan was sent to Lindisfarne from Scotland. And one of the lasting legacies of Celtic Christianity is this. They have this idea called a thin place. Thin places are those sorts of places where heaven and earth seem to kind of touch each other. It's as if the veil between God and earth, the divine and human, are united together. And we find ourselves in the midst of the holy. Now, this sort of thinking is probably pretty difficult for most of us who live in modern times. In more modern times, we've pretty much reduced things to things that can be measured, things that are limited to the 5 senses that we have. We live in a period of time where more and more things are getting figured out, and that's not a bad thing. I'm really, really thankful for the gift of science and the ways in which science tells us more about God's wonderful and vast creation. But the beauty of a thin place is that it's outside of anything that we can fully begin to explain or understand. When we are in the presence of a thin place, we know that we are in the presence of God in a powerful and even mysterious way. While it's hard to put into words exactly what a thin place feels like, I've had those sort of thin places in my own life. Something important is happening here, and it's as though I can't fully begin to comprehend it. I just sense deep inside of me that Jesus is present somehow in this way. A second story related to the first. When I was in college, I had the opportunity to work at a Lutheran camp just south of Asheville, North Carolina, named Lutheridge. And I'm thankful for the ministry that our church has in outdoor ministry sites like Lutheridge or Camp Chrysalis or Ebert Ranch. They are really wonderful places for our youth and for our adults to go to, but also for our young adults. I want to say this is an even greater place to go and work and to spend a summer, to be in a Christian community and to be formed in the Christian faith. My first summer as a camp counselor, there was this night during staff training when we were all gathered together for evening devotions. And it was one of those times when I felt like I was in a thin place. As we were singing and praying together, I remember feeling this power and this emotion that I had never quite felt before. The singing just felt especially angelic. The prayers just kind of felt very, very moving to me. And it was really wonderful to see how everything kind of just came together. So much so that we all knew that surely the presence of the Lord was in this place. It was a great experience for me. But I remember walking back to my cabin that night and saying, now what? Now what? It's nice to have those sort of spiritual highs, to go up to the mountain and to experience God's glory and grandeur in powerful ways. But too many people, myself included, find themselves always seeking the next sort of spiritual high, like a junkie tries to seek the next hit, seeking to stay on top of the mountain, hoping for something more ecstatic, something more of a spiritual adrenaline rush. But life is filled with ordinary moments. There's going to school, going to work, going to church and the grocery store. There's staring at the piles of laundry, wondering what's for dinner, or why in the world the grass is growing in early February. We don't generally describe these sorts of moments as mountaintop experiences. But this morning, I'm reminded that these ordinary sorts of moments are, in fact, the very moments in which Jesus chooses to be present in as well. Now, lest you think that I've gone down a rabbit hole, hang with me for a second. I want to confess to you this morning, my brothers and sisters, that I made a mistake in planning out this morning's gospel reading. I had the option of extending out the gospel reading to the next several verses, to the next part of Luke's gospel. And by the time the bulletin was ready to print, I had missed how these optional verses had kind of come together. So, since I made that mistake, I want to read the next set of verses that are there. The day after Peter, James, and John saw Jesus' glory on the mountain, a great crowd met Jesus. Just then, a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He's my only child." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It throws him into convulsion until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him, and it will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. Now, on the surface, these don't seem like they have a lot to do. Jesus being up on the mountain and then Jesus being down in the bottom of the valley. But the more and more I think about it, the more and more I realize that Luke probably put these together for a reason. It seems like Luke has a lot of stories and a lot of things that get put together in pairs in his gospel. So maybe the mountaintop story goes with the story down in the valley. After all, both of them are examples of Jesus' glory. So, now what? Now that we know that the whole earth is filled with God's glory, not just the mountaintop, but also the valley, what do we do with that? Part of the now what question is to say that worship is a chance to see God's glory. Words are proclaimed, water is splashed, and a meal is shared. And as we hear, splash, and taste in the glory of God, we realize that moments of transfiguration happen here in this place as we gather to worship. And part of the now what question is to know that God doesn't call us to stay here in this mountaintop of a place of worship, but instead the Spirit calls us to go out into the world, because moments of transfiguration are all around us. Here in this place, everywhere we walk, the light of Jesus is shining in the valleys and in the mountaintops. And part of the now what question, I think, is to notice that the disciples don't quite get it, which is very comforting for me in my own questions. But even when we miss the point and we miss what God is up to in the world, changing and bringing about wholeness in the world, there is still this voice that is speaking, saying, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." May we all do that this day. Amen.